Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Rajbir Singh Judge. We're here to talk about his book, Prophetic Maharaja, Lost Sovereignty and the Sikh Tradition in Colonial South Asia. And he is the Assistant Professor of History at UC State University, Long Beach, and a member of the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Dr. Judge, wonderful to have you on today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So, Dr. Judge, if you don't mind, can you talk to us a little bit about why this book?
Yes. So, it's very hard to answer that question, but I'm interested in late 19th century Punjab because it's sort of located as a site of great historical transformation, and therefore we have to ask a question of loss. What was lost? This lost of a prior form. And I'll just be honest, I'm a bit suspicious of historians and their tendency to periodize, right? This attempt to say this happened and then we have a change or a continuity, which itself is a sovereign decision, as numerous scholars like Kathleen Davis have argued, which allows us to cover, right, the lack in the discipline itself. So Duleep Singh's narrative allowed me to explore sort of the writing of history and the making of history and the assumptions historians hold about writing history itself by exploring the loss of an empire, the loss of a kingdom.
And if you don't mind, can you just tell us a little bit about Duleep Singh, who he is and why he's important?
Yes, I'm not sure if he's important. The 19th century sort of is this critical moment for the Sikh tradition. Ranjit Singh united warring confederacies of northwest India, Punjab. He creates sort of a Sikh stronghold, proclaiming himself Maharaja in 1801. He dies, there's secession battles, and the Khalsa Raj, the empire, unravels. And the British, take advantage and they annex Punjab after a series of wars in 1849. The colonial state then exiles the new Maharaja, this child Maharaja, Duleep Singh, to London. There's a series of things that happen in Punjab, especially in relationship to conversion, which the book looks at. But he's in London, he becomes a fixture at the Royal Palace in London, and he's sort of adoringly referred to as the Black Prince by Queen Victoria. Now, this sort of adoration from the Queen starts to dissipate. He's growing older. He's having financial issues, and he's basically also hearing about this lost empire, right, the Khalsa Raj. And he then leads this sort of resistance to basically go and recapture the empire. He defies state orders and tries to travel to Bombay. He stopped in Aden, arrested. He takes Amrit, reconverts, let's say, by just using that language loosely. He goes to Paris. From Paris, he goes to Russia. He's trying to meet with the Tsar. He meets with the famous Al-Afghani, and he's trying to organize this sort of transnational revolt, trying to sort of stop the Suez Canal, ally with the Zubair Pasha in Sudan, organize South Asia. He has this whole wide network, and it fails miserably. His sort of right-hand man, his cousin, Thakur Singh Sundarmalia, is in Pondicherry, but he dies in Pondicherry as sort of what's it called? He's going to be the word escapes me, but he's a prime minister in exile. And he's sort of spreading the word of Duleep Singh's return. And yes, it fails. He apologizes to the Queen, and he dies in 1893. And now this narrative has been told quite a bit. So he's a fascinating figure, especially in the Sikh community, as you can see what kinds of fantasies and attachments he cultivates. And in different sites, I would say, in different diasporic sites, he has different meaning. In England, it's different than in the United States. which is different than in the Punjab. So, but the narrative has been told over and over again. It's something that people know, and even like on Facebook memes, you'll see it like shared. Oh, this is, he fought, etc. But so I was interested more in what kinds of fantasies does Duleep Singh conjure? What kind of desires does he conjure? And what can he teach us, right? His narrative, what can it teach us about historical writing more generally and the fantasies historians themselves hold alongside their interlocutors in a community?
There's a lot there. And so I'm trying to figure out which question to ask next, because there's so much that's just full there. And so great answer in a lot of ways to not only who was Duleep Singh, you also have why you chose Duleep Singh. So you're interested not so much in what he accomplished, because he didn't accomplish a lot, but in what he was trying to accomplish kind of brings out of people at the time. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
And people now.
Yes.
And so a lot of this has to do with kind of, you mentioned fantasies and desires. Is myth making kind of part of that as well?
Yes. So one thing I'm trying, this book does lean heavily into the psychoanalytic tradition. So one thing psychoanalysis forces us to do is to think about sort of in the clinical setting, you have to think about the analyst alongside the analysand. You cannot sort of just look at an object, right, as an object to be discovered. So it's not just myths of the Sikh community at the time, but what kinds of myths does the historian, right, themselves have when they are writing a narrative? And I mentioned periodization earlier. I think periodization is myth making, right? Fundamentally. The classic example of this myth making is what gets to be called feudal, what gets to be called medieval, and what becomes modern. And in Sikh historiography, sort of let's focus on myth making, I think really creates a narrative of redemption in that the community becomes a site to diagnose myths. So there's all kinds of myths that are created. For example, if I'm saying that there's a transition to a colonial Sikh tradition, that the late 19th century is a site of a transformation of the Sikh tradition from a pre-colonial to a colonized form, the historian then, by locating this transformation, can offer redemption. They can say, look, I've discovered the prior form. And this takes many different guises. It can be an alternative tradition. Scholars can say, look, in the late 19th century, a myth was made of a rigid Khalsa identity. And I've discovered a prior fluid form. We should return to that. Redemption. A politics is offered by discovering a past. So the reason I'm focusing on myth making, and I know you're focusing specifically on the question on community there, is because I want to look at how people are constantly creating fantasies. They're working within them. There's these desires can be inhibiting, of course, but there's also something to owning one's desire, which historians tend to disavow.
Can you give me an example of that, of owning your desire in ways that, or people owning their desires in ways that historians disavow?
Yeah, so this question of sovereignty, I think, can maybe get us there. Or religious reform. Let me focus on religious reform, because I think that's really an overdetermined site for thinking about transformation. When you look to own one's desire, if a historian was going to sort of own it, they couldn't give a transcendent account. They would be within. That makes it really difficult then to sort of locate these kinds of breaks, to create certain kinds of diagnoses and pathologies, as if one wasn't involved in that diagnosis. So, okay, I'll just do the sovereignty example, even though it might get me in a little bit of trouble. So a lot of the stuff I would say on Sikh historiography is tied to a certain kind of specter of Sikh sovereignty, which comes to us from the Khalistan movement, an attempt by Sikhs to create their own autonomous state in Punjab, which was violently and brutally sort of snuffed out by the Indian state. This figure of the Khalistani, I would say, is always present in historical analyses, because the Khalistani becomes a representative of an orthodox violent form that then has to be sort of removed by discovering other plural forms. And this is, it's kind of pointless too, because of course human society is heterogeneous. There's plurality. There's multiple different ways in which people define Sikh. Like it's a truism. I think it's like axiomatic. Like if we all know this, like it's kind of an uninteresting historical argument that there's contingencies and there's, all these different things happening. I think to own desire would be to, like, in contrast, think about how one is embedded within those struggles about what constitutes an orthodoxy. So one thing my book is trying to do is say these things are always struggles between people, sometimes not friendly, oftentimes not friendly, but those struggles themselves are indicative, right, of a tradition that cannot be placed historically and pressed down. How do we inhabit those struggles? In academia, I think you're able to remove yourself from those, right? You're able to say, well, no, I'm just giving an analysis. But those analyses are too embedded within a tradition. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at in occupy. It's kind of hard because I was occupying both spaces. I think when you read the book, it's very difficult because it's there's always this sort of working through of what's going on, both for historical actors, but how we're trying to think about it. How are we thinking about something like reform? How does that understanding of reform itself create certain kinds of desires?
And forgive me if I talk for a little bit here. I'm just making sure that I'm clarifying what you have to say, and also trying not to get you in trouble. But if if I understand correctly, it's this idea of when you talk about going back to a previous form of Sikh that is more fluid, it allows us to kind of recover that. But it's this history of the history of it's Khalistan. Am I saying that correctly?
Khalistan is, yes, it was an attempt to create a nation state, autonomous nation state in.
Yes, I was just making sure I was saying it correctly.
No problem.
So, so you have Khalistan, and then this idea that we can recover it by being more pluralistic. We can recover it by being more fluid, and so one way?
I think people are worried. I think it's we don't want Khalistan. The Khalistan movement led to extreme violence in Punjab.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then what we need to do is recover prior forms. Partition is also critical here. Partition divided Punjab. How do we recover a prior fluid form, right?
Okay, I totally misread that. Okay.
Yeah, so that allows us to overcome and I think both sides do it. I think what you'll have is also others, let's say, not interested in fluidity, also turn to the past and say, look, we just find orthodoxy. But my question is, why is questions of truth and justice bound to questions of historical sources? We all know truth and justice do not lie in history. The historical sources aren't what aren't justice. And yet, for the historians, it oftentimes is the recovery of a past context, a past time, right? Again, a question of periodization that leads to redemption. That's what this book challenges and says, no, it's always a struggle. And these struggles are always ongoing. And these struggles are ongoing not just by the transcendent academic who is able to see beyond, right? It's not about historicizing Sikh understandings of history. That's another way you could do this. Be like, well, oh yeah, Sikhs have their own history, understanding of history. Let me historicize that. That's not what I'm trying to do. Because that too then continues the very project, right? The very operations of history without rethinking them. So my thing was, what if we look at this narrative not to sort of recover Duleep Singh, but to fragment him, to continuously fragment him. And in that fragmentation, we can think about questions of justice.
And we talk about religious reform, and
Yes.
I'm not sure if this is a good or I think that this is part of the conversation we're having. So I just read a book on called Mere Christian Hermeneutic, and it's this kind of trying to recover some kind of Christian religious reform.
No, it's it's a lot of money to be made.
Yeah.
Just,
there you go. No, it actually comes out of academic press, so I don't know how much money the author made. Maybe the press made a lot of money, but anyway, that's a different discussion. But
no, we should support academic presses. They don't make much money, so
okay. Oh, there you. Okay, all right. He quotes C.S. Lewis talking about, like, if you're in a tool shed and there's no light coming in except through a crack, and you can see the light, like a beam of light. You know how we often see like a sunbeam and there's like dust going through it? It's like you can look at the light, but if you look along the light, you can look outside and you can see grass, you can see forest and that sort of thing. And I think this is his way of, it's Van Hooser. This is his way of talking about like what Gadamer will talk about with an alienated historical consciousness, right? That you like what you're talking about with a historian who's like, oh, I'm not a part of it. They're looking at the light rather than looking along the light and participating in the community. And there is value in looking at the light per se, but there's not as much value as like using the light to look at things. How does that fit? Do you understand what I'm trying to get at with that?
Yes, I would say, I haven't read the book, so I shouldn't.
I'm
not commenting on the book. But I would say that maybe light and darkness sort of aren't opposed. So we're not, light is the very condition of possibility for darkness. It's not that, so how then do we think when light isn't actually clarifying whether directly or alongside, but actually is what precisely creates darkness. So that's kind of where I'm in this sort of the twilight space where I'm not in either refusing both, let's say, gesture. that would be my response.
Would that, does that capture kind of what you're getting after with historians doing their own kind of myth making?
Yes. So like, I think what I argue, like I can just go over the argument.
For sure.
I say there's like there tends to be two kind of ways to think about Duleep Singh. As if we mourn Duleep Singh, we understand him, we can lay him to rest, and then attachments to him can become sort of pathological. Like, he was a part of an earlier time, we know what he did, it's over, get over it, kind of thing. We've gotten over it historically, the academics have gotten over it, we know, yet they still seem attached. What's wrong? And that becomes sort of, I think, another strand of thinking about Duleep Singh, which then looks at these sort of melancholic attachments, these sort of refusals to lay a Sikh sovereignty to rest, even though it was surrendered. So I think that's kind of like what I was thinking of. So like this sort of, but maybe perhaps we don't need to think with mourning and melancholia so closely, even though, the theorizations of mourning and melancholy are so robust that I don't think I wouldn't necessarily pose myself in opposition to them. But I would say those two would be two tendencies. What if we stay with the rhythms of loss, where loss is not something that just happens, but it's something just ongoing. And in its ongoingness, it's actually creating. So, like, I think the one example I give is there's this portrait of Duleep Singh that Brian Keith Axel points to, that he says sort of becomes the commodity form. It creates a fetish. So you have this portrait. Now that becomes sort of stuck. That's the melancholic fixations on a fetish. But fetishes aren't necessarily, like, fixation doesn't have to be necessarily opposed to creativity, right? We know that, right? If you've ever been in love, let's say, this is a form of fixation that isn't, it can be dangerous, but it can also be quite beautiful because it can create all kinds of new forms. So what if we think about fixation and what is done with the fetish object rather than just taking the fetish object itself as given? So I say in the book, for example, that I'm just sitting there picking at the paint, right? Peeling the paint of this portrait in an indifferent, perhaps, movement, right? That's creating. And I'm really drawing here on, like, notions of the psychoanalytic notions of the drive, which are, I don't really get into in the book, but I would recommend Marika Rose's book on drive, because I was trying to think of, like, going at something without end, without closure, therefore open to new forms. But I'll go into community and sovereignty because I can tie them together, I think.
Yeah.
One way then, but community itself, how is the community defined, right? And Christianity plays a central role. First, we have to say, what a strange question to ask. This is Gil Nijar asks this, right? What a strange thing to say that we can find something that tells us what a community is. We're all in communities. If I was to try to say, let me find out what that essence of that community is, what substance is that community made of, very difficult. And yet, we say blood. Oftentimes, kinship becomes defined by blood. And this is a Christian question. It has to do with Christ, the general kinship of blood, tied to the Eucharist, and all these things. It's essential to understand how community becomes enclosed, a possession. Again, a lot of literature on this that I don't want to get into here, but I will just say that community comes to be immune, enclosed, a possession, something we own. And yet, we also know that community is open. It cannot be realized. You cannot enclose a community. It always remains open. Of course, COVID is the classic example of this. No matter how much we isolated, we put on masks, we remained open to contaminations. That's, it is what it is. So this openness to contamination remains a problem then in this immune community. And I wanted to dwell in this place. What does it mean to think about a community then without enclosing it, while trying to refuse the very question? This is a very common question in Sikh studies. It's, who is a Sikh? It's literally a title of a book in Sikh studies. You'll get this. And it's a very difficult thing to define, as is everything. But I wanted to ask, how can we think with scholars in the Sikh tradition who have answered this question? And what I find is that they have thought about this in terms not just this binary between sort of fluidity and rigidity, but sort of the tension between the two, the tensions between an open community and an enclosed community. So that's kind of what I was trying to do in that part. The question of sovereignty then is, there is no sovereignty, right? We have never been sovereign. What does it mean to be sovereign, right? Instead, what you have are attempts to struggle for sovereignty that are always reaching certain kinds of limits. So how do we inhabit those limits? How do we inhabit limits of sovereignty? It's difficult, but that's precisely what ethical practice is, right? What does it mean to practice? What does it mean to sort of maryada, right? What does it mean to inhabit maryada, ethical embodiment of conduct, ethical conduct? To cultivate ethical conduct continuously without closure, without knowing this, I've reached it, I have become sovereign.
Forgive me for, I'm going to relate it. I'm a devout Christian myself. So when you talk about the blood, like, yes. Oh man, I grew up singing those songs, right? Like the power of the blood, right? Like, of course it's going to be.
And it circulates.
Yes, yeah.
Vigorously.
Are we talking in some ways? You talk about being closed and open at the same time. Would porous be another way of talking about this? Like if your community is going to live, you have to let people come in.
So I didn't want to use porous because I want to think about tensions. So I think one example I'll give is like the relationship between miri and piri in the Sikh tradition. It loosely translates as like sovereignty, and like piri would be like more saintly, sort of this relationship between the miri and piri. And they're always in like, for the philosopher Sardar Kapoor Singh, they can never be a harmonious whole. So when I'm talking about the relationship between like sort of fluidity and rigidity, I'm really thinking about how these become harmonious forms where they're known. So like with fluidity, it is, right? It's circulation. It's set. We know it. Does it make sense? It's like a circulation, it's a flow, but there's no tensions in there. With sort of orthodoxy, let's say, or rigidity, it also too is set. It's a form. But I want to look at sort of the tensions between the two that can't be sort of enclosed. I can't just say it's porous, because it depends on at that moment how it's porous. It depends on how sort of these sort of arguments are taking place.
That's yeah. So if and coming at it from the Christian point of view, I'm just trying to match this in my head.
We all have a Christian point of view. That's kind of one of the arguments of the book.
Yeah. But as you're talking about the ethical form never being closed, it's something that like I'm continually called to repentance. And what I have learned through that is you're like, oh, if I could just learn how to do this better, right? I know that I have grown as a human being. At least I hope I have. Like maybe I'm just fooled entirely. But I've grown as a human being, and I have become a very different person than I thought I was going to become, right? Because as you grow in your ethics, you're going to grow in your knowledge, and you're going to go to different places than you expect. And so that's why it can never be closed off if you close yourself off from, and I'm using the word repentance here, but I think there's I won't say a Sikh equivalent, but there's this idea of if you are going to change and become a better person, then you always have to be open, because you always have to be open to change. Is that, am I understanding you correctly as far as the openness of ethical?
So I can expand on this, but I just want to say, I'm speaking of Christianity, not as an individual practice, but as an institution, that has created our world.
Yes, yeah.
That's what I mean by Christianity. And then I would say that when I'm thinking about ethical conduct, I'm not necessarily thinking about the individual.
Okay.
The individual becoming sort of a better person, but I'm thinking about a relationship between conduct and nam, let's say. So if nam ras is a sort of it means like sort of being enveloped within the divine, let's say, like ras is sort of the elixir of what it means to be in nam. This could be one way to think about how I should inhabit my relation to the divine. Right? Just immersion,
Mhm.
And you see this in certain kinds of ascetic practices, I would say. But Sikh also says, the Sikh tradition, and I get this from Professor Jagdish Singh, is it also teaches us to have maryada, which means limits. It's actually like a shore of a bank. So like limits to oneself. So how do we think about immersion and limits together? One cannot just be in the divine, which might, with the Eucharist, God does become in the world, and there is a harmony in the Trinity, which does lead to conceptions of supersessionism, right? Which is another word for periodization, which I began the critique with earlier.
That's all right. Yeah, you can keep going. I'm good.
So
I'm good.
I was trying to sort of think about what does it mean to inhabit these tensions rather than foreclose them, let's say, with a tradition that often advocates for a certain kind of harmony.
And so I think this is part of the reason you focus a good amount on conversion as well.
Yes.
And as we talk about this, so how does conversion? I think I understand. I'm not sure I'm entirely tracking with you. But I feel like your discussion of conversion fits here somehow.
Yeah. Well, I didn't. I think all the chapters are questions I wanted to refuse to answer, but I cannot refuse. Right. The historiography as such is that one must respond, and my response is inadequate. So, as it must be. So, in the conversion chapter, I'm trying to think about like the difficulties of demarcating conversion when we focus strictly on the individual. So when it becomes like an announcement, right, a profession of one's faith, then I think it doesn't make much sense, right, in the Sikh tradition. What I wanted to say is it's actually embodied practices that created legitimacy for the possibility of something, let's say, of a return, but was never quite a return at all, right? So that was kind of what that chapter was doing. So most people, when they focus on this, would say like Duleep Singh chose to become a Sikh again. He discarded his prior past, and he's now, it's a form of periodization actually right? He's superseding this sort of
demarcated, closed off. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And now redemption. And that's where like Judaism plays such a central role for Christianity and like superseding it. So, but what I wanted to say is that kind of periodization, this focus on like authenticity within the interior, takes us away actually from how it worked in the Sikh tradition, where it was actually what Duleep Singh wanted to do was very unimportant. Instead, you had to create certain kinds of conditions that allowed, right, for the possibility for Duleep Singh to return. And, I work with Tausig, the anthropologist Mick Tausig there, to say it's epistemic murk, that these very murky conditions can create the possibility for like something different.
Can you give us an example of some of those conditions? Are you talking about the British holding him and their education?
No, the book does have kind of a fun narrative in that sense. I think I've been very theoretical here.
No worries.
Yeah, so they've been so it's very interesting because for him to take Amrit, right, he's arrested. So all the ceremonial sort of these embodied practices that I'm talking about have to work through the British. So the British are the ones that are like, okay, we need to collect 5 sects to allow for the ceremony, and they're deeply worried about the ceremony. A classic sort of argument in South Asian historiography and the colonial state is this question of what constitutes intervention into religion, right? So once you say you're not interfering in religion, you've already demarcated what religion is. So you've already kind of set off the parameters of what constitutes religion. So is religion just strictly like individual belief? The state doesn't. So if conversion is individual belief, then they cannot sort of intervene into it because that's Duleep Singh's sort of interior right? Decision, private decision.
Well,
So
forgive me, but I mean, you say that, but like as a child, he's being indoctrinated and becoming
yes.
like, right? So in some ways, like you can, there's this idea of that idea of it's your internal. I'm not saying you're even advocating for that, but that narrative breaks down when you talk about like, oh, well, we have a choice, and you're like, when you take a 12-year-old and all their best friends and their mentors are all Christian, and then they convert and they're like, well, it was his choice. I'm like, that's really like sketchy.
Yes, and then the child plays such a that's a question of immaturity and maturity.
Yeah.
So when does a subject, right, have the capacity to make such a decision?
Right.
And when is it sort of, and that has to do with suspicion too. How does the suspicion enter into the realm of the religious, sort of like, how do we know what he's doing is really religious, or is it for just sort of for certain kinds of political stakes? I don't get into, so for sex, he was indoctrinated as a child. For some, I don't want to get into that. I think the child is sort of overdetermines a lot of how colonialism sort of functions, especially in this question of reproductivity. I'm interested in Duleep Singh precisely because he doesn't reproduce. He fails. He's not generative in that sense. He doesn't have, he has children, but they don't have any children. His lineage dies out, right, in that sense, and yet he survives, which is, right, a non-kin community right there. So the child, I do go into like how those arguments are made, how they're struggled over, right, because it is fascinating what constitutes the mature subject who has the capacity to convert. But I don't want to define the parameters of what constitutes a real conversion.
One
of the reasons I wouldn't want to do this is because it's also really politically charged.
Yes. Yeah.
In India at the moment, where you can never convert out of Hinduism, right? So there's this whole movement called like Garvapsi, it's like the return home. It's like all these people who have converted to like Christianity, let's say, they just don't know what they're doing. They were misled by missionaries. Now we need to return them home to sort of an authentic Hindu place. So that's why I'm like very hesitant to try to locate authenticity in a conversion.
So my goal there, and maybe I did it poorly, but was to more problematize it, if that makes sense.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
And so it's not to answer whether his conversion was real or not. It's to say, even his Christian conversion was deeply problematic. Yes. And then you have the same thing on the other side where it's like, okay, what counts as conversion when you have it's through this filter of British sovereignty? Is that kind of the way that is that one way to think about it?
Yes, it's one argument. We can see how the arguments themselves develop from certain
Okay. I think I'm getting a handle on this. Thank you for your patience.
No, I feel, the problem is also like it's very odd to read one's book. Like, so I'm not rereading. I'm just kind of like going off the fly, trying to remember. Because you hate it, right? When you read it, one hates it.
Oh yeah, it's horrific. Yeah.
Horrifying.
Reading my own writing is anyways, that's a whole other
even
thing.
Watching this, I'm never going to watch this podcast.
I've had so many guests tell me that, like, I started listening and it was great while you were talking, and then I started talking, I turned it off. I'm sorry. So okay, we have the community and we have sovereignty. How does this? So take us to the place now where, and I want to be respectful of your time here. So I think this is a great way to kind of looking forward. How do we deal with what you call a fractured or uprooted inheritance?
Yes, I struggle with this. There's this sort of deep desire for certain kinds of authenticity, of recovering past forms that will give us a politics. And I think this is, it's just a very dangerous form of politics that, as we see in almost every nation in the present, that is not going to help us. I do not want to dismiss claims of peoples like indigenous sovereignty, right? This is why who are the best at theorizing questions of fractured inheritance, right? Because we all inhabit these sort of, look, that's what I said earlier. We're all Christian. At the end of the day, at this point, we all are struggling. What do you believe? Already a question that has so many Christian assumptions. We answer it. One must answer. One can refuse, but those refusals are, then tied to questions of maturity and immaturity. So it's all this kind of difficulty. I do not know what it would mean to write a history of the Sikh tradition. To do that, I had to inhabit this fractured form that I am thinking with multiple traditions. I'm not, psychoanalysis is one. I'm rereading a psychoanalytic literature, which is historically elite, right? A bourgeois form, some would argue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reading it alongside subaltern actors. Some would say I fail, but that's precisely how we learn, by failing. If we were going to learn what we already know, there's no reason to write this book. I already know it. There's no reason to read it because we already know. But what I was trying to do then in inhabiting this sort of fractured inheritance that I inhabit, which I think many do, is to learn. It was to learn, which is fundamentally what being in a tradition is, which you were saying earlier with the question of repentance as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I that was me trying to. Yeah, I understand that that's a Christian concept. I was trying to.
No, it's not.
I come from a gutter.
No. It's Christianity must be thought of as an institution, a corporate institution, as Gil and Ijar would say, right? That isn't necessarily about what individual Christians are doing, but the power, right? Christianity holds, and its own sort of ways in which it has always escaped its own sort of. Through the secular, how it sort of escaped, right, being placed into the confines of religion itself.
The how does you're talking about the fractured inheritance? Is it wrong to try for a synthesis? Is synthesis just impossible? How does the concept of synthesis fit into this idea of these disparate traditions?
That's a good question.
Like you're talking about
Yes.
you're Christian in some senses, like this secular, like you have these Christian underpinnings and you're Sikh at the same time. Is it okay to try and find a synthesis there, like an answer at the other end?
Already we're in troubled waters, aren't we?
Right. I know it could just be impossible.
No, I want to inhabit the aporias, right? The whole book is in a history, right, that refuses to historicize. So that's one gesture of this fractured inheritance, right? So it's which then just draws out sort of aporias that exist in our attempts. Sort of these sort of tensions, right? The rhythms of loss. How are we going to synthesize if we're always already losing, right? We're already in these places of loss rather than of like. So I'm not saying I guess also one thing I'm saying is, just to be clear, I'm not interested in then the loss of its sovereignty. It's also something I say in the book, which is really important. Because once we say we're interested in a loss of a sovereignty, I'm already trying to then recover it. I'm interested in loss and sovereignty because I don't think we've ever been sovereign. We're never. So how are you going to recover or synthesize something that's fundamentally not there?
Well, when you're talking about about sovereignty, are we talking in some ways about would another kind of adjacent concept be the autonomous individual?
Yes.
The autonomous
the
community.
Self. Yes. So that's why the conversion.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I'm thinking about this. Right.
Right.
So that's the whole question of like, what does the historian do? You have to sort of, there is attempts to sort of proclaim mastery of sources. Like what becomes a primary, all these sort of things, right, are strange to me. I mean, I just find it really strange, the whole like attempt. And yet people do it. So, and I'm trying to have a conversation with them to like work through certain kinds of arguments, while refusing to say, "Oh, look at them. They have this type of history. They have." So that's another thing. It's sort of an accumulation aspect of it. Like, oh yeah, there's multiple different types of history. So let's just like collect all these different versions. What I'm saying is, no, the very project itself is impossible. So how do we sit with that impossibility? And what kinds of conditions of possibility emerge from the very impossibility itself? Again, that goes into like how I was talking about the fetish object too. These things aren't necessarily like enclosures. Like they also then things emerge.
So are we talking in some ways about, so that in particular, when we talk about enclosures and the fetish, it's about enclosing people a lot of times like, oh, if you use this fetish, you have a very distinct enclosed identity. But what you're saying is you can have this fetish and you can have an open identity as well.
I don't think in terms of identity, but like I think when we think about
yeah, it's probably not
the sovereignty. So like, let's just think about the portrait. If the argument is that the portrait of Duleep Singh is a fetish object that then encloses the community, they're too attached to this form of sovereignty that's been lost and they can't let it go. What I'm saying is like, it can be a fetish, but it doesn't have to be that they can't let it, like, it can just exist. That people are playing with. There's like playfulness. There's all kinds of like ways in which people relate to objects that doesn't necessarily have to be about enclosure.
Yeah. It can be. Can it be transformed in a sense? Can it become like something for like hope?
Yes. That's what I said. Like a form of fixation itself leads to sort of a rupture, right? Because if you're like fixated long enough, it's not that object.
Yeah.
Like a worry stone, I guess, would be another example.
Yeah.
Like you have anxiety, it's a small repetitive movement, but the stone is going to eventually disappear, even though you have repetitive movements, toward it.
Dr. Judge, I just want to say thank you for coming on. But before we kind of close off, what is one thing that you would ask our audience to do or to think about over the next week? Something like a major takeaway from today's interview that you're just like, this is what people should be thinking about. This is what someone should do, kind of as to take away from today's interview.
I'm not sure I can give advice on what people should do.
What would you recommend?
But I would ask them to think about how to inhabit tensions, in their life without sort of grabbing an easier answer, especially history. I think the turn towards history is really more harmful than good. I would ask them to be more creative with the past, in ways in which people will inevitably struggle against them. But you can't have basically like, so people say, I mean, the one response I get to something like a statement like that, I'll just make a counterpoint because I know where this is going to go. Well, what about like alternative facts? We need to fight against alternative facts, right? That's kind of we have to give the real history because people are making shit up. I mean, but people still keep making shit up.
They do, yeah. It's a continual struggle.
Like this idea, basically, politics cannot be located as a politics of knowledge. That's not what politics fundamentally is. We want it to be that way. Academics, of course. If I give the true history of Duleep Singh, sects are going to be different. No, it's not how it works. It's just not, because their fantasies and attachments and desires cannot be reduced, can't be dissipated by authentic knowledge, like whatever that is, right? Because somebody else can write a different narrative of Duleep Singh, right? We all know this. Historical knowledge is constantly shifting and changing depending on the sources you use and the new sources that emerge. That's what I would ask, I guess, your listeners to think about is, what does the call towards more knowledge actually do? What has it done? Especially as universities invest so much in violent technologies of war and destruction as our world burns around us.
So learn to be comfortable with the tensions. Learn to face them without fear. I appreciate it. Dr. Judge, it's been an absolute joy having you on today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.